Jewish quarter, but the controversy is over the opening of the new entrance from the northern section underneath adjacent to the Via della Rosa.
Right, so that the issue that this brings up really has to do with the Netanyahu government taking an action that Rabin and Perez said would not be taken before final status negotiations determined the arrangements in Jerusalem, right? So the idea is that this would prejudge or be a symbolic claim, and that it has more to do with that is, it's more of a political and diplomatic question, if you like, than anything to do with religious sensibilities.
Exactly, yes. I mean, I think that there are indications that the previous Labour government was willing to enter into some sort of arrangement with the Palestine Authority that would be workable and agreeable. But that the decision was made by Netanyahu to open it, and to open it at midnight. I mean, I think that this is the event which triggered. This was the immediate trigger of the hostilities, but I think it goes much beyond that, of course, because there's been frustrations that have accumulated, grievances regarding the building of new settlements. That no prisoners have been released, many homes have been demolished in Jerusalem, no withdrawal has taken place from Hebron, even though it was scheduled 6 months ago. So I think that it finally came to the Palestinians that these aspirations that they've had 3 years ago with Oslo are not really going to be realized, and that the new Israeli government has its own ideas about peacemaking ideas that they don't really seem to feel are consistent with real peace.
I think it's important to correct what I consider a fallacy and a misrepresentation in the press and the media, that somehow current situation is attributable to this new right-wing Likud government. And my own work in Gaza and the West Bank, but especially Gaza over the last 3 years, it's clear the situation has been deteriorating since September 1993. And I've been there at least 5 or 6 times this year alone. And each time I go back, it's gotten worse and worse. The various measures imposed by the Israeli government since the agreements were signed are, have had a very pernicious effect. The closure in particular. There's 74% unemployment in Gaza. There's 50% unemployment in the West Bank. People have lost their jobs. They've lost their incomes. Hunger is a problem. Malnourishment, malnutrition are problems, especially in Gaza. There's been continued expropriation of land. There's been building of settlements or expansion of existing settlements. I read recently that under Rabin and Peres, the number of settlers in the territories increased by 40%, from 100,000 to 140,000. And the sense that although certain, freezes were imposed on the building of new settlements, they were voraciously building around Jerusalem, and they were expanding existing settlements. The only difference, one can argue various differences, but fundamentally I see very little differences between these two governments. Labor implemented and imposed a number of policies in these areas that built up the frustration and the rage and the tension that exploded, over the last 2 days. The tunnel issue is a flashpoint. It would have happened, in my view, this sort of violence would have occurred under a Paris government too. It's just a matter of time. Because
one of the problems, of portraying the Paris and Rabin government in those shades is to ignore the terrorist bombings, which in turn had powerful reverberations on the whole labor market structure. And my sense, in fact, is that it helped to undermine, that the power of that 40% in the electorate that were quite prepared to deal with an open labor market. And tragic. And so to portray the Labour government as if it wasn't searching for a way out, I think misrepresents really an opportunity that the Palestinians have acquired. I don't think they were really given it. They acquired their own opportunity. But the fact that the Labor government was dealing with a powerful threat from its own population, responding to the terrorist bombings.
Well, I would
raises this whole specter of the labor market structure.
Well, the labor market structure was largely in place in terms of reducing the number of workers. It was in place before the bombings. I mean, the number of workers from Gaza and the West Bank, particularly from Gaza, allowed to enter Israel, had dropped precipitously before last February. And between for February and March, the numbers were pretty much frozen. Nobody could get in. And then they allowed people slowly to enter. So the current levels are no different. They're about 17,000 workers from Gaza working in Israel, which was the same, maybe it's a little bit less than it was in January. So this idea of closure and forcing Palestinians out of the Israeli labor market occurred before the terrorist bombing.
But isn't the rate of the importation of foreign labor from Romania related, to some extent, to the responses to the terrorist bombing?
Well, the first closure the main closure, I should say, was imposed in March of '93, when there was a lot of violence and Palestinians were entering Israel and attacking Israelis and killing Israelis. So Rabin imposed that. But the numbers, even up until that closure, had been dropping very, very much. And then since that time, the numbers have been steadily deteriorating. This is a policy
I understand,
of
but I have family in Israel, like many
So
of us do. And I remember being very impressed with the fact that as a result of the rising tensions from the killings and the explosions, if the central government hadn't acted, the city governments would have acted, simply from the pressure of their local populations.
No, I'm not saying the Israelis clearly had domestic interests to which they had to respond as a government. I mean, Rabin, whether one agrees with it or not,
Right.
One can understand that he was responding to a certain constituency. But on the other hand, I'd like to make one point, and then I'll let other people talk. And that is that, terrorism is clearly an issue, but the whole phenomenon of terrorism among Palestinians and in that part of the world is very directly linked to Israeli policies in the territories. When you impoverish a population and you deny them the ability to work and take care of their children and literally put food on the table or put enough food on the table, people feel that they have nothing to lose. And in fact, what we're seeing today is an example of extreme despair and frustration and hopelessness. And nothing occurs in a vacuum. Everything is interlinked. And I have been arguing for years that the greatest threat to Israeli security in that part of the world is by denying people the opportunity to work and take care of themselves and live as normal a life as possible. I mean, there's nothing more threatening to Israeli security, if one wants to look at it in those terms, than having a hungry, impoverished, and angry population on its own.
Oh, I agree with that. There's no problem with that.
I want to shift a little bit to issues specifically related to Jerusalem, because while I agree that this was a flashpoint related to many different problems, I think Jerusalem and the Judaization of Jerusalem was a very key piece. And I would say primarily that has very little to do with terrorism. That has been an ongoing policy, certainly through labor as well as Likud, to Judaize East Jerusalem, that several years ago already there were more Jews than Palestinians in East Jerusalem, huge, massive, what I would call settlements, some people call them neighborhoods within the borders of annexed East Jerusalem, plans that do not allow Palestinians to build, and so if they get desperate and they build because their families grow, their houses can be demolished. I mean, there are so many ways in which the Palestinian population is deliberately kept down in Jerusalem, and the Jewish population is expanding. I mean, it's happening with attacks on Palestinian institutions. It's happening with the closure in terms of not letting Palestinians in to worship in Jerusalem, to go to hospitals in Jerusalem, to go to schools in Jerusalem. Much of this has nothing to do with terrorism. It has to do with a claim not just to have an undivided city and not just to have the Jewish Israeli capital in Jerusalem, but to have Israeli sovereignty, exclusive Israeli sovereignty over the entire city. And clearly Palestinians don't want that. Why should they?
I mean, that brings up a question I feel I have to ask, which is that if a sequence of events had not happened, that is, Yigal Amir had not assassinated Rabin, you had not had the retaliatory assassination of the bomb maker known as the Engineer. And you hadn't had the retaliation to that, which was bus bombings in Israel. And Labor had been reelected. Would the same thing have happened? I mean, there's an implication in what you're saying that sooner or later we would have had the same thing.
I would say yes. I would say yes, because I think that the differences really between Labour and Likud might have been exaggerated in the press, in the sense that one is accommodating and the other one is less than accommodating. That here Netanyahu has been in power for 100 days. And he has been stonewalling. He has been unwilling to meet Arafat to discuss the major issues that have been pending and so on and so forth. But I think that the main issue here is what is really the conception of a settlement with the Palestinians that Israel has, both Labour and Likud. And it seems that the approach does not really differ. And that is a solution based on no sovereignty for the Palestinians. And in fact, if there is going to be a sovereignty, if there's going to be a Palestinian state, it would really be a Palestinian state not different from the Transkei Republic and from these so-called republics in South Africa. So they may call it a state, they may fly the flag, they may have the trappings and so on. I mean, I think that the Labour government was somehow more accommodating when it came to the trappings. Netanyahu is not even willing to get into the trappings or to even give the Palestinians the dignity that some of the Labour people were willing to give in exchange for this agreement, which I think is being seen by most Palestinians as a form of surrender, as finally having surrendered to a Bantustan solution. So it really has to do with Oslo. And I brought with me the map of Oslo. I don't know if it can be really, if the camera would capture it. I mean, you can see that it is, you have enclaves on the map here. And so a contiguous Palestinian territory in the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank being actually only 23% of what used to be Palestine, is now divided into more than 100 enclaves. And this is really the essence of it. I mean, this is Labour's project, and this is what Likud is continuing. So I think that we have stylistic differences between the two, but the frustrations, I think that the socio-economic as well as the political factors are there. And it was bound to happen sooner or later. And even if it's pacified today, I mean, Netanyahu said that he wants to meet with Arafat now to talk about how we can calm the situation. I suspect that this would really be the lingering issue, and that is the main Oslo formula, which I feel has never really been debated. It has not been debated there, and it has never been debated here.
Right. Aren't you further now from a fruitful debate about Oslo than you were when there was a Labour government? And isn't there a qualitative difference between Labour saying in its party platform that we don't exclude the possibility of a Palestinian state, and Netanyahu, as one of his first gestures when he takes power, saying there will absolutely never be a Palestinian state?
There are differences. They're matters of degree, but they're not fundamental differences. And I think under Likud, clearly Likud is unwilling to make some of the cosmetic concessions that Labour was prepared to make. They're much more blunt, and the outcome, whatever it will be for Palestinians, I believe would be the same or will be the same under both. It may happen quicker or more quickly under a Likud government. But, you know, I've spent a lot of time on the ground in the Gaza Strip, and you see the impact. One sees the impact of the last 3 years of a Labour government. And it's impossible in Gaza for people to earn a living. It's impossible for them to move around. They can't travel. They can't go to school. There are myriad restrictions. And, of course, with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which I would say the majority of people see as corrupt and repressive, and rightly so. They see the fact that this authority has been allowed to evolve in the way it has as a direct outcome of Israeli and / American policy. That as long as Arafat addresses the security concerns of Israel, he will be allowed to repress his own population in whatever way.
Encouraged.
But if you look at it that way, then I think we ought to step back and see another perspective. There's a national liberation movement seeking to establish its claim for sovereignty by appealing to the moral rightness of its cause, seeking to get support from surrounding Arab states and to some extent from the rest of the world, facing a state and a people that's not exactly on their wavelength. And from the perspective of that national liberation movement with all its different factions, a number of them know that when it comes to establishing a democratic state, a liberal democratic state, they're not going to get the support of their Arab neighbors, who'll probably be scared stiff of such a liberal state. Mm-hmm. So the only place in the world where they can get any kind of support in the direction of that movement is of a portion of the Israeli electorate. You know, we've been talking about the Labour government and the Likud government, and you've been suggesting that there's not a significant difference.
But it depends.
But you only just finish the point. That is, they, after all, are representative of portions of the citizenry. Okay. And a good portion of that citizenry knows it's facing a national liberation movement that's seeking to challenge some of its very fundamental assumptions. They're not going to lie down and just get rolled over. So obviously it's going to be a terribly tough struggle. And under those circumstances, not to see, in my judgment, significant differences between that 40 or 45% of the population, including the Arab population, that's willing to move in one direction in comparison to that other 60% that really is much more inclined to throw up a stone wall and, if necessary, go to war, and I don't know what, on a permanent basis, I think misses what this has been all about. And to the extent, I think that Palestinian politicos who are so critical of Oslo, who may have very good reasons for being critical, especially if they've been in the Palestinian movement for a long time, not to recognize that this is a little window of opportunity. It's not a very big window, but it's a little window of opportunity. I think is missing a terribly important moment. I mean, this is really a defining situation.
But I think that Oslo is hardly the window of opportunity that it is. I mean, it may have appeared that way, and right now, I mean, Arafat is probably thinking that his maximal demand would be to convince Netanyahu to adhere to Oslo, while you have about 5 million Palestinians, 4.5 of them in the diaspora, and at least another million or so in occupied territories who think that Oslo is not the solution, that Oslo is the problem, really. One point that you made about the question of existence, I mean, I don't think that if you criticize Oslo, then you really are questioning the existence of the state of Israel. I mean, I think that...
I didn't suggest that.
Maybe I misunderstood.
Right,
No, all I'm saying is that...
You were talking about...
all I'm saying is that... I'm saying is if you come to Israeli society, Israeli population, and you say Jerusalem is my capital too, you're going to meet a stone wall.
Yeah.
I mean, if in my ideal world, I always thought that the National Liberation Movement ought to declare Hebron its capital, and then work for Jerusalem slowly. I mean, there'd be enough fights over Hebron.
You described a failure on the Palestinian side to make political distinctions when they look at Israel. And I think there is a mirror image on the Israeli side. That is, it's not, whatever the faults of Oslo, without getting into that, what actually happened historically is that Rabin tried to break the resistance in the Intifada.
Oh, of course.
It didn't work. Right? And it didn't work, it couldn't work.
Right.
And because it didn't work, they came to another arrangement in the interest of security.
Right.
Netanyahu has a slogan that you'll have peace with security. In fact, I think the historical experience teaches that without peace, there's no security. However, there's an element, maybe that 60% that you're describing, that looks at the Palestinian side, doesn't like Arafat, doesn't like the nationalist movement, and says there is no difference between Hamas, for instance, and the Palestine Authority.
Agreed.
And the reason that Rabin and Peres first went to Oslo was because Arafat, in his weakness, was about to be put out of business, literally. He was going
I
bankrupt.
think that's right. Very
And they were able
important.
to.
And
Yeah,
the
right.
strategic understanding that Rabin had was that he would be soon face-to-face, Israel would be face-to-face with Hamas. And there was no deal possible, whatever deal they wanted to
They
make.
converged.
And so now
Right.
it seems
That's
to me,
absolutely right.
if you fail to see the distinction, you return to square one. You go back, and it's even worse than it was in 1987 when the Intifada started.
Well, at this moment, my hope is that this will be Netanyahu's moment of recognition. If Rabin had his moment of recognition, then maybe this will be Netanyahu's moment of recognition.
You know,
I mean, that's the only silver lining I can see in this whole situation.
clearly, there are distinctions, but the question is, how meaningful are they, and what are they? Okay, and that's really what we're all debating
that's
here.
right, yeah.
And you rightly pointed out that when Rabin negotiated with Arafat, he was in an incredibly weak position, and his popular base of support was eroding in Gaza and the West Bank, and he knew that if he didn't cut some sort of deal with the Israelis, his political future was over. But because he was so weak, the terms that he was able to negotiate or not negotiate, and the terms that the Israelis were able to impose, again, in my view at least, led to the present situation. We weren't talking about altering the status quo here of occupation. We were talking about changing the form somewhat, allowing Palestinians perhaps increased powers in certain domains, but within an overall structure of occupation. I mean, military law remains the law of during the interim period. I mean, there are lots of issues related to the occupation and to the status quo ante before Oslo that remain firmly in place. The structure remains exactly the same, and that's why this thing, in my view, was unworkable from the beginning.
So the occupation has never really ended.
No, it hasn't,
And I was-
technically or legally.
Yes, I mean, I thought that I heard something today on the BBC with Nabil Shath, one of the ministers in Arafat's authority, talking about, my God, we are being reoccupied. And the first thing that came to my mind is that you've never really been unoccupied.
And if you go to
occupation
Gaza,
law is the supreme law of the land, basically.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, if I think about it for a moment, then if you have two different calendars, then you don't see the situation the same way. I mean, from the vantage point that you portray, the occupation never went away.
No.
But if you're on a calendar of gradualism, where these steps are supposed to create some kind of confidence-building attitudes, then all these steps lead to a decline in the occupation. If you look at it from those 60% of the Israelis, they're on an entirely different calendar. They want a lot of training ground. And, so when you have these different calendars in collision, it's very easy to see misperceptions, and I'd like to come back to the point I was trying to make before, namely that you misread that 40% of the Israelis, what they were really trying to do and what they were up to. And I think not to try to build on that, as bad as it is, don't misunderstand me, as bad as it is, and as fragile as it is, and as little as it is to miss a golden opportunity.
And
I don't think it
can I
ever
ask
was
the
a
question
golden
whether it's really
opportunity.
possible that let us assume that there is an opportunity, just for the sake of discussion. Is it possible that Netanyahu can refuse now to pursue the opportunity again? And I'm saying that not only because of the violence in the territories and or in Israel, but because of the regional situation. That is, Shimon Peres correctly understood there was a link between what happens
Absolutely.
internally and Israel's acceptance, which had great economic benefits already in the
Tremendous.
earliest stages
Right.
for Israel.
Well, they're being maintained, I assume. I assume those benefits.
Well, Netanyahu has one reason, and I think one reason only, to move in the opposite direction where he's been moving. Unless he's a complete idiot, and I'm beginning to think he's got potential for that role, but unless he's a complete idiot, he must understand that the one weapon that Egypt has, and that Syria has, especially Syria, but Egypt also, as well as the Palestinians, against Israel, is to do everything to weaken it as an attractive economic investment and its economic development. Egypt has seen a shift, I think, in its potential role in that region. I remember when Schultz suggested that Egypt, Turkey, and Israel would become the great engines of development in the wake of the end of the Cold War. One of the things that's happened is that it looked for a moment as if it's going to be Jordan, Turkey, and Israel, with Egypt playing second fiddle. They don't want Israel. It doesn't want Israel to become this economic power. Syria doesn't want to become Israel to become an economic power. And the Palestinians surely know that violence is the best weapon they have. So Netanyahu, who's interested in economic development, must surely understand that much at least. Because if he doesn't understand that, then it's straight to hell.
It doesn't feel to me as if Palestinians responding this point thinking this is the best weapon we have. I think people are responding out of enormous accumulated frustration. That's what it feels like to me. I can't speak for Palestinians. I think that it seems to me that there have been elements, post-Oslo elements in both versions of what you're talking about, that certainly there were the accoutrements of coming together. The recognition of the PLO representing the Palestinians was kind of the biggie, letting people have the flags and whatever, not explicitly prohibiting settlement expansion, not explicitly prohibiting it through Oslo, was absolutely, I think really the Achilles heel in some ways. I mean, Sarah talks about the economic issues, which are also critical. But I think that, the fact that Netanyahu can go to Washington and say, look, there's been 40% increase, natural increase. Who ever heard of 10% a year as a natural increase? I mean, what's going on over there? And, how could we do less than what Labor did? And Clinton acts as if he didn't know what Labor was doing. I mean, this was all happening. Palestinians have been seeing their land taken from them. We have visuals of olive trees of roads going through, of olive trees being demolished, of almond trees being demolished. I mean, the land is being taken away from under them, and I think this is basically a conflict about land, and that's, one of the problems. There have been positive elements, but that's been one of the most difficult.
And Netanyahu, I think, must feel that